Hello everyone and welcome back to ThursDev. I'm your host Luke, and today we'll be continuing our series on metrics-aware game design with a chat about player retention, one of the most important metrics in measuring a game's performance, and one which can be a huge thorn in the side of any developer. In the case that you aren't already familiar with the concept of retention, it's fairly simple. Retention measures how many of your players that started playing the game return to play the game again. If someone's tried your game and decides to continue playing over the next few days, that player is considered to be retained, at least for that period of time. We typically measure how many have returned the next day, in 3 days, in a week, in a month, and so on. It's a measure of the longevity of your game and how quickly your players churn or quit playing your game and not return. Though there are many reasons that a player might not be retained, the one that's most common is that it just didn't interest your players enough to grab them right away. As you may be aware, with the market saturation in games, it's very easy now for a player to buy and try out your game for a few minutes, maybe play around in the options menu, and still never even get through the opening sequence of your game. This is why, in the current gaming landscape, being aware of retention and doing all that's in your power to promote retention is important. If you haven't grabbed your player in the first few minutes, many of us have such a massive backlog of games and a stable of favorites that it's entirely possible that we'll go elsewhere and never try your game again. Which, of course, you don't want. In order to measure retention, we typically use analytics tools to check for game logins by user ID and test them against their first login date. This of course requires that there are analytics hooks that fire on load, which also track both unique user identifier and date and time that the hook is triggered. Fairly simple, but it's important. This allows the developer to track the basic metrics of retention, though some additional hooks at strategic points in your games, usually in tandem with other analytics calls, will also allow the developer to gauge session length and other valuable points of data, all which feed into the same overarching theme of maintaining the interest and loyalty of your players. But why do we care about retention specifically? Well, depending on the type of game that you're working on, the answer to that question will vary. In the free-to-play game space, in which I'm employed, retention has a direct correlation with conversion, a metric that we'll talk about later. If your players are coming back often, that means that they're engaging with your game more and are more likely to eventually convert, if they decide that the game is worth spending money on. If your game isn't free to play, retention still plays an important role. Say that you're creating a multiplayer game. As I mentioned in a video titled The Loneliest Lobby, a multiplayer game lives or dies by the health of its user base. An average player will probably not be thinking about this much, but consider how matchmaking works. You have a player who, out of 24 possible hours in the day, gets home early from work and wants to get a game in at 4:30 p.m. before dinner time. Unless there are other people playing during that time frame, they won't be able to find a match, and will be statistically less likely to try again at that time. The more players stay after their first experience, the more healthy your player base becomes, and, naturally, the easier it becomes for a player to find a match when they want it, and therefore the better your matchmaking becomes. The scenario in which retention has the least bearing is in the case of the single-player premium game. We still prefer that the player continues to play the game and remain interested, however, especially if down the line we plan on releasing expansion content. If a player's already stopped playing, it'll be harder to entice them to restart a game than it would be to continue playing with more to do. So whatever the flavor of your project, retention is valuable, and even if you choose not to use analytics software to track the behavior of your players and confirm, you should still be considering always how to best keep your players' interest and how to get them coming back regularly. But let's assume that we are tracking this data. The tricky part of measuring retention is that there are a lot of schools of thought as to how properly to measure retention for the purpose of determining performance, and depending on how you measure this, expectations should also be very different. If you've dabbled in analytics with an eye to retention, you already will have heard the terms full retention, rolling retention, and classic retention. That's 3 different ways of interpreting data that you're trying to measure, and for each, the connotation and reasons to measure are at least different in nuance, if not intent. I'm going to go over each type here so you have an idea of what they mean when they're referenced, and talk about why you would want to measure it, and some very basic ideas of how you could design towards each. Note that I'll be going into much more detail about specific retention-focused mechanics in the next video, but this is more of an overview. So let's start with full retention. Full retention, in simplest terms, only counts users that have logged into your game every single day without fail. The moment any user misses a day, they're no longer counted in full retention. This particular metric is much less used in games, as we recognize that, generally speaking, players will take a day off here and there, and we tend to design around it, but we do prefer that players are playing our games daily. The most common mechanic that speaks to attempting to gain full retention is the daily login bonus mechanic, rewarding players more for every day that they play consecutively. Next up is classic retention, also known as static cohort retention, the most commonly used metric to determine actual game performance on a regularly updating basis. It grabs only cross-sections of players by checking for specific milestones. It's measured by how many players are active in the game on the 3rd day, 7th day, 14th day, or whatever nth day you're measuring relative to their first day of install. So if you're measuring day 28 retention, then you're measuring every player that first logged in 28 days ago and seeing if they're still playing today. They might have missed a day or two in between, but if they were there on that day specifically, they're counted, and they're not otherwise. There are some logical issues with classic retention, as it can completely miss players that return with an offset of 1 day, and even miss a player that otherwise has full retention, but classic is still frequently used as a barometer for overall performance. To achieve classic retention, we typically need to model a play timeline that incentivizes the player to return on those specific dates, though due to the nature of gaming being an exercise of players of varying skill interacting with the game's mechanics, it's hard to ensure that a player is counted here short of shooting for full retention. So we do. Finally, we have rolling retention, which tracks, out of all players, which players have logged back in on or after a certain span of time. Consider it a measure of return rate, or the opposite of churn. If a player stopped playing on their first day, but returned 10 days later, they're continued to count towards day 3 and day 7 retention, even if they weren't there specifically for those days. Each player is counted as a unique data point, and their contribution to retention informs the entire app's performance at retaining users. Rolling retention is the prime metric by which we measure churn, which describes a player leaving the game permanently. All players minus rolling retention equals churn rate for a game. Special campaigns and other return bonuses speak to rolling retention, as well as timer-driven mechanics that encourage the player to come back to complete a task that they've set in motion prior. There are many mechanics that can help a game achieve a better rate of retention, and being particularly mindful of retention, how it's measured, and your goals therein, you can design your game to encourage players to return more regularly. I'll be following up next week with a primer on designing for retention, but I hope that, for now, you're a little bit more comfortable with the concepts of retention and the ways that we measure it. Thank you for joining me today in this episode of ThursDev, and I sincerely hope that you'll consider returning next week to continue this series with me while we experience metrics-aware game design principles with retention-driven design next week. If you'd like to join this little collective of game creators and consumers, please consider subscribing to our channel and checking out the other content that we have to offer. If you only care about ThursDev, there's also a ThursDev playlist that you can follow to receive specifically only our ThursDev videos. Whatever your decision, however, I do hope that I'll see you here next week so I can add you to my day 14 retention on this particular series of videos. Until next time though, take care.